We resume Aggression Part 2. It's a wonderful day in the neighborhood. I was persuaded to put on a different shirt that we found in the back of the closet, and even better, I got new markers. And just to give you a sense of before and after, look at that contrast and some other colors as well. That has us poised to leap in even further into our topic, doing our 1 second before, minute, hour, etc. on Monday, looking at aggression, looking at antidotes to aggression, looking at the behavioral level. And if there were two themes that came out of it, the first one is, like in lots of ways, we're exactly like every other species when it comes to aggression and when it comes to affiliation, altruism, compassion, etc. And in lots of ways, we are completely unprecedented. And as we will see in terms of the wiring of the system, it is very similar in all of us different species, all of us primates, and then we use it in totally novel ways. Unlike any primate on Earth, we can kill somebody on the other side of the planet whose face we've never seen. We can save the life of somebody on the other side of the planet. So this positions us now to start looking at what's going on in the nervous system seconds before your good act, your bad act, what brain regions, what anatomical regions are relevant, and we left with the shocking insight that the limbic system has something to do with it. So we now begin to dissect this even further, and you better bet what we are about to land on in great deal is the amygdala. The role of the amygdala in aggression, in fear and anxiety, the role of inhibiting it by the prefrontal cortex in order to rein in some of those things, amygdala. So, what's the evidence that the human amygdala is involved in aggression? We've already seen some bits of it. You can have stimulation of the amygdala, as in rare types of epilepsy that start off in the amygdala a few seconds before seizure onset. People will have an epileptic aura. They will suddenly say, "Oh, I'm just so angry, and then are hit with a seizure non-specific activation. So a disease example of that, you can see activation of the amygdala during functional brain imaging when you've got somebody evoking fear in them, evoking anger in them. Ooh, can you tell the different parts? Is there a fear part? Is there an anger part? No, completely intermixed. Then you see evidence from things like Charles Whitman, the guy who in the early 60s climbed the clock tower, University of Texas, shot people below after killing his mother, killing his wife, leaving notes there saying, "This is like the love of my life. I have no idea why I did this." And on autopsy, a tumor pressing on his amygdala. That as more evidence. Where you really get some disturbing stuff is the notion of surgically removing the amygdala. We already saw patient SM with that super rare disease that destroys the amygdala, but nowhere else in her brain, and all the strange sort of differences in behavior you saw in her, and inability to recognize fear faces, things of that sort. And somehow, out of all this literature, it occurred to a couple of behavioral neurologists in the late 60s, early 70s, to come up with a very clever idea, which was, this was around the time that the 60s were officially taking off with lots of protests and people camping out on campuses and all sorts of commendable things. And along with that, all sorts of inner city unrest and riots and things of that sort, which took America singularly off guard. And what was suddenly suggested by this trio of neuro people at Harvard was, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea to explore the possibility of taking out somebody's amygdala, taking out the amygdala of somebody who is uncontrollably violent. That could be useful in all sorts of ways, especially, I am not quoting exactly, but I'm coming damn close with paraphrasing here, especially turmoil in inner city populations. Whoa, are you kidding me? They actually suggested this, and outrage in all sorts of quarters at the suggestion that, oh, just a little bit of therapeutic psychosurgery and you could take care of all sorts of populational unrest. This trio was sort of lionized in some circles and just ripped to shreds in others, and horrifying that they suggested this. And most horrifying of all is, it turned out it was done occasionally. Court-ordered amygdalectomies, destroying the amygdala, and you could guess examples of individuals with a history of intractable violence, examples of people with maybe one act of violence, example of kids, teenagers refusing to listen to their parents, and the parents decided to go get an amygdalectomy. Fortunately, it went out of vogue in the United States pretty quickly, but it continued to be used in quite a few countries for many years afterward. For example, I believe India holds the record for the most involuntary amygdalectomies done on people. So, horrifying piece of it. And we already know there's two subsections to the amygdala. There's the out part and the in part. The lateral towards the sides, the basolateral amygdala, and the central amygdala with a blue marker, hooray. What this is about is the central amygdala, I think we've already heard, is ancient. It is primordial amygdala. It is amygdala that talks to reptiles and such. This is about fears you don't have to learn. Fears where prepared learning and spiders and dangling over open spaces and things of that sort, the central amygdala. Basolateral is much more recently evolved, and when you look at it, it's kind of like a wimpy version of the cortex. It's good at learning new things to be afraid of, learning that sort of thing. And what you see is the central amygdala is the main outflow talking to everybody else in the brain. The basolateral first feeds into there. And what we see here is something about the centrality of the central amygdala. Central amygdala gets scared of something. It does not pass its message through the basolateral before exiting. Basolateral, social values, individual differences, all of that, it just shoots straight out from there. Okay, inputs, outputs, what else about the amygdala? You get people with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's an expansion of the amygdala. Neurons there grow new processes, and enough of them, synapses become more excitable, enough that the amygdala actually gets big on structural brain imaging. And this was like an amazing thing that convinced Congress back when that people coming back from war who were shattered with PTSD were not just indulging themselves in the lingering, whoa, brain changes, expansion of the amygdala in response to trauma, combat trauma, sexual trauma, things of that sort. And that went hand in hand, as we already heard, with sustained trauma and stress, shrinking of the hippocampus. And that became relevant a couple of weeks ago. Glucocorticoids cause the amygdala to get bigger and cause the hippocampus to get smaller during chronic stress. It's the same hormone and the same receptors and the same promoters. And how does that work? And what we saw was the differentiating thing were different cofactors for the glucocorticoid receptors. Okay, so PTSD accomplishing that. PTSD enlarging, one might ask, we will be getting eventually to some of the changes, structural changes in the brain with depression. And in both cases, you ask the question of, are these effects reversible? And for the most part, not. And that may not mean that when you get rid of PTSD, the amygdala is able to shrink back to a normal size of normal reactivity. I think it mostly means at this point, nobody's figured out how to cure anyone of PTSD, just how to give them means of containing it more. Okay, so we've got the inputs to the amygdala, a zillion of them. We know already from our circuitry. We know 2 of them at the top of our list. Our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, all the ways in which the frontal cortex is trying to make the amygdala be sensible, that input into there. So that's one of our 2 big important inputs. The other one we saw the other week, the fact that sensory information, example, in your eyes, come in and go to this thalamus and then go to the visual cortex and starts processing. And that whole business about how in under a tenth of a second, there's this shortcut straight from the thalamus to the amygdala. The thalamus knows there's something terrifying before you're even consciously aware of. The thalamus knows there's something terrifying, and it's not terribly accurate at figuring out what it is looking at. Outputs from the amygdala. We already know ventral medial PFC portal up to the cortex. We know that deal. We know the deal from SM, that very unlikely finding that with the when the amygdalas are destroyed, her eyes do not look at the most informative places in the face. Part of what the amygdala is doing is telling your eyes where to look. Another projection, which is so important that I forgot it, we've already heard hippocampus. Amygdala talks to hippocampus, and hippocampus helping the amygdala form memories, very local memories, larger contextual ones about fear and trauma. Finally, this area, which I think has only been mentioned once or twice, the basal ganglia. You sit and you think, I am going to do this with my arm right now, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is talk to area and talk to the motor cortex, and thus you do this. Somebody scares you or something, and in a tenth of a second, you do this at them. This is the amygdala. Thanks to that, the amygdala sending a rapid signal to the basal ganglia, which talks to the motor cortex. Habitual stuff, reflexive stuff, and this is the world of thalamic shortcuts, inaccurate assessment, and a trigger gets pulled. So, the picture of the amygdala like that, you begin to see very interesting aspects of amygdaloid function in a neurogenetic developmental disorder, incredibly interesting disorder called Williams syndrome. Williams, I'm forgetting which genes are deleted. It's a whole arm of one of the chromosomes or something. There's all sorts of things. There's cardiac problems. There's a very distinctive facial structure that you get in kids with Williams disease. And if you look at pictures of it, the word that was used endlessly in the literature, but is now considered a little bit passé, insulting, something or other, is pixie-like, elfin features, and you'll see kind of pointy ears a bit and a very cherubic elfin sort of face, and there's been no shortage of speculations that elves, some sort of origins in Williams syndrome. Williams syndrome behaviorally is super interesting. There's some degree of cognitive impairment on the average, and what we will hear about in the language lecture is, strikingly, you get individuals, your average individual in this considerably below average IQ range, and you will see not a whole lot of sophistication in language use. Williams kids are incredibly verbal, articulate, long, big vocabularies, all of that, despite often a considerably below average IQ. We're going to look at that in the language lecture about how aspects of language production can be a whole separate module from everything else going into intelligence. Okay, so that's interesting about Williams' kid. Then the most interesting thing of all is they are hyper social. They are incredibly social. They are incredibly affectionate. They are famous for just like running up and hugging strangers and all of that. And you better bet that the Williams individuals who survive into adulthood have all sorts of vulnerabilities in that domain. But they are hyper sort of expressive of emotion, good at reading facial expressions, all of that remarkable. So what's going on in their amygdala? Interestingly, what you see is you show them a scary snake, you show them a whatever, standard scary whatever, and the amygdala is hyperactive in people with Williams syndrome. Wow, that's kind of exactly the opposite of what you would expect. But now you show them a picture of an angry face, and the amygdala barely responds at all. It is somehow wired up with this genetic disorder, wired up so that scary humans aren't scary and instead elicit all sorts of pro-social stuff. And before you know it, you're running up and hugging strangers, and there's interesting stuff with vasopressin and oxytocin, with this being the most interesting thing there. And you see, here we have in Williams, show somebody with Williams a scary snake, and this activates even more than average. Look in the world of things you have to learn to be afraid of, and much of that is about our fellow humans, and it is hypo-reactive. Final factoid about Williams, which I think is like one of the most interesting things in the universe, and everything about this disease syndrome is fascinating. But an additional one, people have identified some of the genes that have been implicated in Williams syndrome, the hypersociality, the affectionless, how affectionate they are, all of that has been found in another species. And I'll give you a hint. You don't find these relevant genes in wolves. But part of domestication of dogs is they had some genetic changes that have some resemblance to the genetics of Williams, and suddenly you have like golden retrievers who are willing to like slobber on anybody's face, and hypersociality. Moreover, you see some breed differences. Dog breeds that are more or less friendly seem to have more or less of a genetic load of this Williams-like profile. Totally interesting. Yet again, what we managed to breed into these animals. So, we've got the amygdala in these circumstances. We already know one interesting thing about the amygdala back from depression. We know that in people with major depression, the amygdala is atypically responsive to pictures of sad things instead of scary things. And we already discussed, whoa, that's totally weird. I thought the amygdala is about fear. And as we will get to in a couple of weeks, if you are somebody with depression, the scariest thing on earth is anything that might make you feel sadder than you already are. So the amygdala sure has a special response there in that case. Finally, you look at people with social phobias, and the amygdala is normally reactive to snakes, normally reactive to any such thing, is hyperreactive to faces of strangers. So what we're seeing here is the amygdala, a contrast between stuff you don't have to learn, stuff you do, a contrast between things that are socially contextual, things that have a lot to do about deciding who as an us in our species is scary and who is not, as opposed to the easy worlds of like dangling by a bungee cord is going to activate the central amygdala every time. So that being interesting. Obviously now, the next thing, we're going to transition to the frontal cortex. And we know the drill already, frontal cortex trying to suppress aggression by way of this, the over-the-top hyper-emotional amygdala overwhelming the prefrontal cortex. During stress, this arrow weakens. During stress, this arrow strengthens. This arrow strengthens as well. And there's a dorsolateral PFC projection down to there, which is keeping an eye out in case that idiot amygdala doesn't listen to our inhibitory signal and tells the basal ganglia to do something impulsive and disastrous. Let's have some inhibitory effects there as well. So inhibition here, and during stress, this projection weakens as well. All the realms of impulsive violence in circumstances of fear. So, when we begin to look at this frontal cortex, it is not so much controlling behavior as much as just kind of whispering in the ears of the limbic system. I wouldn't do that if I were you, just kind of putting its foot on the brake. And what that winds up translating into is the frontal cortex, the PFC, is the most expensive part of the brain, metabolically. Why? Here's an example of what this would look like. And suppose you've got a person, monkey, rat who has been trained as follows, which is the signal comes on saying it's one of those learning sessions. And the deal is, every time a light flashes, if the individual presses a button, they get an M&M, something rather good happens. So here we're recording, we're looking at the visual cortex, and every time the light flashes on, you get a flash of activity in the visual cortex. And you could see every time that happens, like a tiny bit later, a second later, the motor cortex activates and they press the button. And this obviously went from visual processing up to the frontal cortex, dorsolateral PFC saying, aha, okay, let's send a message now to move that finger. What's going on in the PFC? The second it gets the signal that, oh, it's one of those sessions, the PFC turns on and stays up like that. Individual examples, individual actions, keeping track of we're in one of those sessions where when the light flashes on, then press the button. The PFC has to keep track of stuff like that. And as you can see there, it's expensive, which gives rise to a really interesting feature of a bunch of neurological diseases. You look at Alzheimer's disease, you look at Parkinson's disease, you look at Huntington's disease, a whole bunch of these, where often it's another part of the brain, actually in all three of those diseases, it's another part of the brain that is blown out of the water, different places in each case, the area where damage happens, and then you look, and every one of those and a bunch of other neurological diseases, number 2 on the list, number 3 on the list is the prefrontal cortex gets damaged as well. In at least one of these diseases, prefrontal cortex gets damaged first, and you see all sorts of behavioral disinhibition. Prefrontal cortex is expensive. Expensive parts of the brain are vulnerable parts of the brain. So, we already know much about what's going on here. The nucleus accumbens ventral tegmentum dopamine projection to the prefrontal cortex. That's the motivation that's giving you the energy to study around the clock for the MCATs. That's giving you the motivation to be able to tell the amygdala not to go and pull a trigger if you get there in time. So PFC with that. And we've got a sense by now of what happens when the PFC is damaged. We already looked in some detail on the other side of the board, the consequences of damage to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, disinhibition, damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, no gut instincts about anything, trouble making decisions, and the decisions that you make are heartlessly utilitarian. But when you look at the PFC overall, most of it is more dorsolateral PFC-ish than ventral medial PFC. Ventral medial is just like getting some whispers from the limbic system. Overall, the PFC is much more like the DLPFC. What happens when you get damage, broad damage to the prefrontal cortex? We know already. It's Phineas Gage. In contemporary settings, you will see it where somebody has a stroke. And this is somebody whose behavior gets highly disinhibited afterward. And this is in nursing homes where you get like assaultive behavior on the part of some 80-year-old who's had a frontal stroke. You get like ghastly incidences of inappropriate sexual behavior, things of that sort. So we see more evidence for what's going on here in terms of damage. Which brings us to a subject near and dear to my heart at this point, which is how the criminal justice system makes no sense whatsoever. All of the codes around this planet for deciding when somebody cannot be held responsible for their criminal acts because they're insane, they're psychotic, they're organically impaired, any such thing, always revolves around the same exact decision and the same historical character. A man named MacNaughton, who in the 1850s, 60s, I don't know, sometime or other, attempted to assassinate the Prime Minister of England. He didn't succeed at that, but he killed the Prime Minister's assistant or some such thing. And when brought to trial, what was apparent to everyone was MacNaughton was very, very troubled. And when looking at his history, he was a perfectly together guy. I think he had his own business, a merchant or something, and he started hearing voices. In his early 20s, he took to wandering, he took to voices telling him to kill the Prime Minister because of some imagined slight or whatever. And we will hear in the schizophrenia lecture just how classic of a profile this can be. Everyone now in retrospect thinks that MacNaughton had schizophrenia. He shot the person, he injured the Prime Minister in the process, and in the trial we had a remarkable landmark event, which is even the prosecution along with the defense and the judges said this man is so abnormal it would be criminal to criminally convict him. And MacNaughton instead spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital. This was really pretty much the first case of innocent by reasons of insanity or guilty but insane, some such thing. Predictably, the press in England went crazy at this point. Oh my God, this guy is getting away with trying to kill the Prime Minister. Queen Victoria herself contacted the judges saying this was a very, very imprudent decision, not punishing this man for what he did. Nonetheless, landmark. What is it that was formalized out of the MacNaughton ruling for deciding if somebody is too psychiatrically, neurologically impaired to be held responsible for their actions if they don't know the difference between right and wrong anymore? That's the MacNaughton ruling. If you are so thought disordered, psychotic, driven by voices in your heads, hallucinations, whatever, that you cannot tell what's right and what's wrong anymore, that's grounds for an insanity defense being successful, which, by the way, is incredibly rare in the legal system. Okay, that's great. But now you look at somebody with frontal damage, and this is where you have an enormous challenge, because this is somebody who still knows the difference between right and wrong. This is somebody who can tell you the rules. This is somebody who can tell you how irritated they are with themselves the last time they did something impulsive and it didn't work out well, and this time I'm really, really, really going to resist that. And then they do exactly what you would expect from somebody with damage to their prefrontal cortex. Whoa! You know the difference between right and wrong, yet you can't regulate your behavior, involitional control of things like that. And that is sort of the fighting point. There are so few juries in this country and so few courts or any such thing that is interested in somebody who knows the difference between right and wrong, but because their frontal cortex was destroyed in some accident, can't regulate their behavior. And what is remarkable with that is, again, the person can verbalize what the rules are. They'll say, oh, I know, it's tempting to push that button, but it's not as good of a reward. I'm going to push that one. I have to wait longer, but it'll be a great reward. It's tempting to do that, but I'm going to do the one that's more demanding, but I get a better reward out of it. And at the last moment, they go and reach for the wrong one. I'm fairly sure I just flipped the contingencies, but you get the point of what I'm saying. They can even tell you, I am going to do the harder thing because that in the long run is going to pay off more. And they can say, here we go. And then at the last instant, if circumstances are sufficiently emotionally aroused, you get them reaching in the wrong way. And as I've noted a few times now, the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the history of damage to it from concussive head trauma in, depending on the study, anywhere from 25 to 75% of people on death row in this country get damage there, and you can have somebody who sure as hell still knows the difference between right and wrong, yet they can't regulate their behavior in circumstances of high emotional arousal. What happens if the prefrontal cortex is damaged in someone when they're very young? They often don't even learn the rules of the difference between right and wrong, and this has come to be called, I think it was Damasio who first used the term, acquired sociopathy. So this brings us to considering like sociopaths and other people, individual differences, and how well the prefrontal cortex works. We already know stress wreaks havoc with prefrontal function, and we know a huge amount about how that works on a molecular level by now. So lots of stress in your life, and that's not going to look good. Lots of stress in your life, and your prefrontal cortex thins out. Dendrites shrivel up from neurons there and that sort, and you get a whole lot worse at regulating your behavior. So this brings up two different profiles in people at the opposite ends of the spectrum. First one, repressive personality. This is like your freshman roommate who you wish you could have one sliver of the self-discipline they had. They work like crazy. They resist temptation. They're highly structured lives. They have patterns that they follow each day, and they walk to work the same way each day. They eat the same meal. They have these very, very regimented lives with very tight control, and their emotions, they repress their emotions. They're lousy at reading other people's emotions. Repressive personality. Oh my God, what a crippling psychiatric profile. These are people who are very successful. They're super motivated. They're self-disciplined. All of that stuff. These are people who every time can study rather than go out and party. Repressive personality. Whoa, that's interesting. So what's going on in them? And you look at their physiology, and it's precisely what you would expect. Elevated frontal metabolism, like squeezing their psychic sphincters tightly shut all the time with the frontal cortex working, and elevated glucocorticoid levels. Whoa! What's that about? I think this gives you a fascinating lesson in sometimes it could be incredibly stressful to construct a world that is so predictable that nothing stressful can ever happen to you. That doesn't come cheap. So, elevated metabolism in the prefrontal cortex, and what you might also expect is when you then throw a curveball at someone with a repressive personality, something that can't be controlled, something that is unpredictable. When things spiral out, they freak out in the frontal cortical metabolism sense, they freak out in the emotional sense, they freak out when all of that effort into having a nice, safely constructed world doesn't wind up being sufficient. It costs a fortune to surround yourself with a wall all the time that keeps you safe, keeps everything out. That doesn't come cheap to have a life without stress especially when that turns out to be ineffective. In contrast, at the other end of the spectrum, we have sociopaths. Sociopaths, and we'll hear stuff about their autonomic nervous system in a while, but what's most interesting about them is evidence of some atrophy in the frontal cortex, evidence of abnormal function of the prefrontal cortex, and it's in an interesting way. So here, you put somebody in a brain scanner, a control subject or a sociopathic individual, and by the way, people in this business make very clean distinctions between sociopaths and psychopaths, and I can never remember which is which, so I use them interchangeably. But what you see is under resting conditions, sociopaths have lower resting activity in the prefrontal cortex. The brakes aren't on. We will hear tons more about their affective, their capacity or incapacity to feel anyone's pain, but lower resting level of metabolism in the prefrontal cortex. Now give them a task requiring frontal function, months of the year backwards, whatever it is, a frontal task, and in order to have the same degree of success at the task, to score the same score as a control subject, sociopathic individuals have to activate the prefrontal cortex much more than usual. It's got to work harder to pull off normal levels of self-regulation. It does not work very well. What else? What else? We know the PFC goes completely offline during orgasm. It goes offline during REM sleep, and that's why dreams are dreamlike, that sort of thing. And what we then get is there should be an interesting dichotomy between violence, aggression that is premeditated, and violence, aggression that is impulsive, and what the prefrontal cortex and amygdala have to do with it, and those are two completely different beasts. An impaired prefrontal cortex, an overactive amygdala, is all about things going very, very wrong with impulsive violence, and they have much less to do with premeditated. And we will see in a while things like sentencing laws for violent acts becoming more harsh, less harsh, or whatever, have wonderfully constraining effects on premeditated violence and have essentially no effect whatsoever on impulsive violence. More bits about the prefrontal cortex. So, one can start getting all proud about the fact that we humans, we've got the biggest prefrontal cortex out there and all that sort of thing, and other species don't have as much. Nonetheless, they can do some of the same cognitive tricks. Here, for example, here we have an organism, and it's inside this area, and it's got a tempting, easy task, and it's got the doing the harder thing. In this one, if they press a lever twice, they get a reward. And this one, if they work twice as hard, they get 3 times the reward, and it's totally obvious that's what you should be doing. And what you see instead is every single time they go for that one. Now, instead, do the study where the easy, tempting one is in this room, and the working harder one is in that room, and they're outside. They've got to choose the room. And you see in that circumstance, they're much more likely to be able to do this. Oh, you're not that lever. It is so appealing, and I know I hardly have to do anything. And oh my God, that one is so exhausting. So I'm just going to... And here, when you get some distance, when some of the saliency of the moment is toned down, you have more frontal control of your decision making. So that's totally cool. What's also totally cool is these are pigeons. These are studies done with pigeons. A guy named George Ainsley did these studies in the 70s showing if you take down the emotional salience, emotional pigeons, the limbic system, but even still, if you make them a little bit less able to look at that lever and it's so damn tempting, you can get more regulation of behavior. And you see the exact same thing in people and in chimps. For example, you have a kid you have a kid, or you have somebody with frontal damage, or a chimp, and here's the deal, the researcher stands there, and this hand has 1 M&M, and this hand has 5 M&Ms, and you can have whichever you want, and after a while the individual is trained that if you reach for the 1 M&M, something very different happens in the 5. Reach for the 5, and the researcher quickly snaps back their hand and gives you 1 M&M as a reward. Reach for the 1 M&M, and you get 5 M&Ms as a reward. Show some self-control. Don't reach for the 5 M&Ms because you're getting a much better payoff if you reach for the 1 instead, and kids cannot do this. Kids will even verbalize saying, I know, I should reach for the one with 1 because that's better. Sociopaths can't do this. Chimps can't do this. But now, make the lure, make the stimulus a little bit less just right there in your face. Detach it a little bit. Now instead, 5 magnets and 1 magnet. Reach for the 5 magnets and you get 1 M&M. Reach for the 1 magnet, you get 5 M&Ms. And now suddenly, kids and sociopaths and chimps can do the task, and they can regulate themselves enough to say, 5 little magnetic things, I don't know, that's not really getting to me much, go for the 1. We know that's more of a payoff. But instead, if it's M&Ms right there, you're looking at it and you can taste it already, and you know I'm going to reach for the 1, and every time you go and you get the 5 instead, because you're much closer. There's more emotional salience to the temptation there. So that, as a measure of the amygdala, can get away with stuff more readily, can override frontal regulation when it's right in your face, when it's in the moment, when it's impulsive, when you can smell the chocolate, or when you see the person's face right in front of you that you hate beyond words, and that's when the amygdala slips loose of the frontal cortex regulation. Last couple of things about the prefrontal cortex. So, you damage it and you get impulsive violence, you get disinhibition, you get people telling other people that they can't stand their hairdo or some such thing, even though that's a faux pas and all of that. Why isn't it more often the case that when you get damage to the prefrontal cortex, you have people who are now running around and giving away their life savings to some charity and proposing marriage to strangers and all of that? Nobody understands why the disinhibition is usually in the direction of antisocial behavior rather than prosocial. The last thing about the frontal cortex with respect to all of this, so we've already heard the PFC is super expensive, vulnerable. What happens during aging? And it turns out the PFC and the frontal cortex in general is one of the hot spots in the brain where neurons die over the course of aging. Old pictures of you lose massive numbers of neurons every day about 3 days after you graduate. No, there's not massive neuron loss, but there's a few areas where there is substantial amounts, and PFC is near the top of the list. And again, because of how expensive, how vulnerable it is, what are we beginning to explain here? Oh no, grandmother totally upsets the grandkids by saying that she thinks their hairdo looks hideous, or they're disinhibited, or no, you can't marry that person, they're terrible for you. And old age, people tend to become disinhibited. What's the classic interpretation of that? As we get older, we're more comfortable with who we are. We've grown to accept who we are. We understand that being like everybody else isn't quite what it's wrapped up to be. We're less vulnerable to conformity, to peer pressure, all of that. Aging is a time where you are more content with who you are. And if you want to say something, you're going to say it and not have these social inhibitions anymore. Like hell, no, that's not what's happening. Because the prefrontal cortex is losing neurons as you're aging, you get disinhibited. Again, a very expensive part of the brain. So we know already the tons of stuff going on in terms of the amygdala and the frontal cortex interacting and explaining the general observation that the higher somebody's resting level of prefrontal activation, the lower the amygdaloid level. An inverse relationship. Okay, moving on to some other brain regions, the septum. We've heard septum mentioned back in that limbic lecture, and we will mention it once more in one sentence here and never think about the septum again. In lots of ways, the septum does the opposite of the amygdala. The septum inhibits impulsive aggression, and thus if you lesion the septum, if you destroy the septum in a rat, you get septal rage, and a rat that is just over the top aggressive. Okay, so our theme of one part of the limbic system puts its foot on the gas, the other the brake, working in oppositions, jockeying to tell the hypothalamus and the cortex what to do. Another region, lateral hypothalamus, that used to be all about aggression, and I've already alluded to that back in the 60s. Like a decade worth of research went down the tubes because people studying the lateral hypothalamus, seeing its behavioral effects, thought they were seeing aggression, and it turned out they were seeing predation. And those are two completely different things. And that also gave rise to all sorts of gibberish. In the early 60s, there was this faux anthropologist named Robert Ardrey who pumped out one bestseller after another. Man, the Hunter, Dawn on the Savannah, the Territorial Imperative, incredibly influential, and he made a ghastly basic mistake in that he intermixed the neurobiology of predation with the neurobiology of aggression and said, oh, as soon as humans became hunters and got a taste of meat, it's inevitable that humans are violent because hunting and violence go hand in hand, and that's our legacy, which we can't do anything about. No. Hunting is neurobiologically the same thing as opening up a box of cereal. People lost tons of work sort of going up that alley. More. Other areas, we know the anterior cingulate and its role in empathy, feeling somebody else's pain, and we will see where that's really relevant to trying to contain aggressive impulses, and when it fails. And we know in the ACC that's central to that whole emotional business going on the limbic system, talking to all of the cortex, including the ACC. That's your feel experiment. That's not your thought experiment. That's your feel experiment. How is it going to feel if I do this and this is the outcome and this happens to them? How are they going to feel? So the ACC is relevant to that. Anterior cingulate without invoking the notion of mirror neurons in there. We've already heard that. Okay, so now we get back to the insula. And the insula now is a portal to all sorts of cool stuff with the brain and behavior. We already know the basic deal with it. Every other mammal out there, it's gustatory disgust. It also gets some olfactory disgust. In us, it's imagining it. In us, it's moral disgust. Fascinating. And we were left with, hey, that's interesting. Moral disgust, that's just kind of a metaphor. Neurons in the insular cortex cannot tell the difference between disgusting food and disgusting moral acts. How did that happen? Moral norm violations are 20,000 years old. The insula is 100 million years old, invented moral disgust, and somebody decided, hand that to the insular cortex. Evolution is not an inventor, it is a tinkerer. And what we saw there is a first pass at how the brain has trouble telling the difference between reality and metaphor in the insular cortex. We saw that in the sex lecture last week. The brain has a lot of trouble telling the difference between external beauty and internal beauty, metaphorical stuff. The brain has had to just push in new metaphorical ways of doing subtle stuff socially in the last 10, 20,000 years. and dealing with a 100 million-year-old part of the brain to sort of jump in there, and you wind up having a brain that confuses reality with metaphor very readily. An example of that, we already know, the anterior cingulate. Poke somebody's finger and their anterior cingulate activates along with other pain areas. Poke somebody else's finger of a loved one and you feel their pain. Oh, come on, you're not really feeling their pain. For a neuron in the anterior cingulate, it is feeling the pain. It cannot distinguish between the two. And a very interesting finding related to that, there's a neurotransmitter called substance P. It is so obscure, it's never even gotten a flashy name. It's still whatever that substance P is after A through O turned out not to be interesting. Substance P has something to do with pain, mediating pain pathways. There's a little bit of a start of a literature back when, which hit a wall, and I don't know why, of using drugs that blocked substance P receptors having antidepressant properties. Whoa! Pain! We're talking about pain pathways. We're talking about like your cells splitting open from an injury and all of that. And psychic pain is using some of the same neurotransmitter stuff in the anterior cingulate. Feeling somebody else's pain for a neuron in the anterior cingulate can feel as real as pain itself. Empathy like that, the neurobiology of it, it had to be squeezed in somewhere. Let's have the part of the brain that does literal pain also do psychic pain, empathic pain as well. Another version of this, you tap into sort of disgust, dis-ease sort of pathways and such, and you can see in studies, you have people read a little article about like antibiotic-resistant bacteria and brain-eating bacteria and pathogens and the threats of new ones emerging from who knows where on this planet, and somebody sits and reads that pretty intensely, and in the aftermath, on the average, they're more hostile to immigration, legal or otherwise. Ooh, infectious stuff coming in from out there. This part of the brain, where we've got the insula again saying, ooh, disgusting bugs, disgusting pathogens, disgusting people who are not from here. Again, intermixing the two in that regard. And an assigned reading for today is this very readable piece in The Atlantic about how xenophobia interacts with people's political stances, interacts with their threshold for disgust, exactly as alluded to. Then there's another realm in which the brain is falling for metaphor, taking it literally, and this has come to be called the Lady Macbeth effect, the Lady Macbeth phenomenon. Sit somebody down and have them tell you about something neutral they once did in their life, or something wonderful they once did, or something appalling and disgusting and immoral, or let them write about it anonymously, or something or other. And what you see is, when people have been reflecting on really bad stuff they may have done, they feel soiled. They feel soiled in what turns out to be a very literal sense. Give them like some puzzle thing to fill out where, okay, fill this out, complete this word, and this could be wish, this could be wish, and at a higher than chance level, if you were just telling about something appalling you've done in the past compared to neutral or positive, you are more likely to say wash. You are more likely, rather than swap, slip, you are more likely to come up with soap. You are more likely, you have cleansing yourself more on your mind. More studies like that. People come and do some volunteer thing where they're telling you something wonderful they did or something horrible, and afterward you say, you know, we can't pay you, but we can either give you this little packet of hand wipes as a thank you thing, or this pen with the name of the psych department on it as a thank you. And when people have just been spending time talking about disgusting things that they've done, they go more for the hand wipes. Other versions of this, you can show people differ as to whether or not they want to wash their hands or brush their teeth versus when they've been writing about something awful they've done, your hands are soiled. Telling about something awful they've done, your mouth is soiled. All of that, this is a fairly consistent finding. This is quite and what it's telling you is feeling morally soiled and feeling physically soiled. There's some neurons in there that can't tell the difference, and insula is right in the center of this. And what you then see is confusion. Moral soiling makes you want to clean your hands or wash your mouth out or whatever. So here's the most interesting thing about that finding. You have somebody who's just had to tell you about something awful and disgusting they've done, and now you set up an experiment in the lab. Somebody is walking past, and they've got a whole pile of books or papers or whatever, and oh no, they trip right in front of this person and drop it all on the floor. How likely is this person to jump up to help? And if you've just been telling somebody about awful things that you've done, you become more likely to jump up and help. If you've been telling somebody about awful things you've done, but you've had a chance to wash your hands, to take a break, to go to the bathroom, whatever, before we do some more testing and unsoil yourself, you're now less likely to jump up and help. You have washed your hands of it. Lady Macbeth, Pontius Pilate, all of those metaphors in our minds are so literal that the ability to wash our hands will change our helping behavior. So, totally cool things. What is this telling us? It's telling us something inconvenient. Oh no, you confuse external beauty and internal beauty. Oh no, you feel less likely to help somebody if you can, disinfect your house after you've robbed the old lady of her dialysis machine. Who knows what? Whoa, all of that. On the good side, this is this realm again. You need strong emotional associations now and then to do the right thing when it's the harder thing to do. And if moral disgust has your stomach lurching, that could be a very helpful thing at times. Once again, as we saw previously, in a value-free way. You could need disgust to get up and try to get yourself to right a wrong, or you can have it to get up and work hard to do a wrong, or all of that. But we have this metaphorical brain that is very relevant to things like this. Okay, so what we're teetering with here is this big classic question in moral philosophy, moral decision-making. Do we think our way to a moral decision, or do we feel our way? We already saw that work with Josh Green in our runaway trolley problem. Do you pull a lever or not to kill somebody to save 5? That's a cortical process. That's frontal cortex. That's DLPFC. Do you push them with your hands? That's limbic system. That's ventral medial PFC. Completely different pathways relevant to that decision making. And what moral philosophy has been dominated by forever, no surprise, is we think our way to our moral decisions. We are in some crossroads of doing the wrong thing or the right thing, and we only have a second to decide. And what do? We think about what would Immanuel Kant have done at that moment? What did I learn in freshman philosophy? We're uber rational beings, so of course we are thinking our way to moral decisions. And what people have realized more and more in recent years is, most of the time we are feeling our way to a moral decision, and what you see in the aftermath is you trying to rationalize your emotional decision to make it seem as if it was rational. Here you see a great example of this in the work of Jonathan Haidt at NYU. He's one of the leaders in this, who really shifted the field towards thinking you feel your way to emotional decisions rather than think your way to it. Brain imaging stuff. Have one of those sort of challenges of what's the right thing to do. And what his work has shown, and since replicated other people, is you can see the decision is made in the limbic system before the cortex then kicks in. The cortex coming up with an explanation for the emotional decision you have made. And Haidt gives a great sort of litmus test for when this is going on. If somebody is telling you, I can't tell you why, but when those people do that, it's wrong. It's just wrong. I can't put my finger on what exactly is wrong about it, but it's just wrong. What you are seeing is a limbic system that has just felt its way to a moral decision, and a cortex that hasn't come up with an explanation yet that supposedly justifies it. And if the person then, a week later, comes back and says, you know, I was thinking about it, here's why it's not okay for them to do that different thing, all it means is they've had a week for their cortex to come up with a rationalization for why their limbic decision was a rational one. If someone is saying, I can't tell you why, but it's wrong when they do that, or this is the better thing to do, like this is a more moral thing. You hear somebody say that, and you have just proven how much our moral decision making is driven by emotions rather than thought. More stuff. One other area of the brain that is very relevant to aggressive acts, and it's part of the hypothalamus and the brainstem and the midbrain. Okay, what are they about? They are modulating function of the autonomic nervous system. And you look at somebody who is in a rage and has just committed a savage murder and all of that. Big surprise, the sympathetic nervous system is usually aroused and stress hormones are being secreted. So the hypothalamus and the logical midbrain and brainstem areas are doing their thing to shut off the parasympathetic and turn on the sympathetic and get all in a rage and do this violent act. And then you look at somebody who is highly sexually aroused, and we already know you eventually turn off the parasympathetic and turn on the sympathetic. You get the same autonomic signature for rage, arousal, orgasm, intense love, momentness of intense feelings, all that. They look the same, because whether you are running for your life or running to wind up in the arms of someone you love or whatever, your heart's going to have to beat faster to deliver blood to your leg muscles. You get a very similar signature. Now, we saw the relevance of this already. This is the reason why the James Lange theory could not be right in the 1900s version of it, which is your body decides what you're feeling based on what's going on in your body. And it doesn't work that way because your bodily responses take 1 or 2 seconds and your brain is much faster than that. What your bodily responses, your interoceptive information coming to the brain is telling you how intensely you are feeling that. So the point there was you get similar autonomic signatures for very different emotional states. Now let's translate it into this realm. What does it mean that in moments of intense rage or intense love, your cardiac cycles are doing the same thing in your sympathetic, and it's indistinguishable? This, I think, a wonderfully moving quote by Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel, his famous statement, "The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference." And when you look at the physiology of love and hate, both have way more in common with each other than either has with indifference. And Wiesel's argument being that some of the greatest pains in the world are not due to contrastingly failing to show love and showing hate instead, but failing to show love and show indifference. And that is absolutely clear in looking at the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so now we switch to our next half bucket here. Now looking at what's the neurochemistry. We know the brain regions that are relevant. What's the neurochemistry that's playing into whether you will do the right thing, the wrong thing, the savage thing, the empathic thing, whatever. And yeah, dopamine's got something to do with it, big surprise, and we already know one of the key things it does is it fuels the prefrontal cortex, that mesocortical dopamine projection in there. It gives the prefrontal cortex some of the motivation, some of the backbone, some of the oomph needed to do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. So we already know dopamine's role. But here we bring in another neurotransmitter that we've heard very little about so far, serotonin. We look at the serotonin system. So there's a literature by now, rodents, monkeys, humans, suggesting that when you have low levels of serotonin, less serotonin being released in serotonin synapses, not every synapse in every part of the brain, but parts of the brain relevant to aggression. When serotonin levels are low, you are more likely to get aggressive, violent behavior. So people did all sorts of logical studies at that point. Suppose you get rid of the precursor, the thing that you turn into serotonin, the amino acid tryptophan. Tryptophan, there's a couple of steps and it gets turned. Suppose you get rid of this so that serotonin levels go down. You get your lab rat being more aggressive. Boost up the levels of this, the opposite. You've got this enzyme, tryptophan hydroxylase, which is key in making serotonin. Block its activity, serotonin goes down, aggression goes up. Do the opposite. So that's a fairly solid literature. Ooh, low serotonin, high aggression. What people eventually figured out was all of these findings were not about aggression, they were about impulsive aggression. In the moment, serotonin manipulations have nothing to do with premeditated violence. It was all impulsive stuff. So people went looking for predictors about who had great serotonin systems and who didn't, and there were a couple of, in my opinion, appallingly bad papers that got published, one of them in Science, which had some of the most sleazy thinking in it, and I've been complaining about that paper for 30 years, and it wound up being extremely influential, but when you look closely, there's interesting stuff going on. So, we know about neurotransmitters. Serotonin comes out, action potential here. Serotonin floats across the synapse, binds to the receptor, and then we know two things can happen at that point. A reuptake pump removes it from the synapse. No more serotonin, signal is ended. Or a degradative enzyme can take the serotonin and break it in half and flush it down the toilet into your cerebral spinal fluid. You terminate a serotonin signal by either reuptake or degradation. And what began to be clear from some of the animal studies is the gene for this enzyme, MA monoamine oxidase, there's different subtypes of them, but we're ignoring that, is that there are different genetic variants of them, and they varied as to how good they were at breaking down serotonin. In other words, how good they were of clearing the synapse of serotonin, which led to all sorts of predictions about what you would expect to see. Ooh, if you had the version of the MAO gene, which was really good at breaking down serotonin, you're going to have a serotonin shortage, more aggression. That was the prediction. And people went and looked, work by this guy named Caspi and colleagues, followed people for their first 25 years of life, genotyped them, and looking at age 25, did they have a history of antisocial behavior at that point? And you know where we're heading with this one. If you had the bad, scary version of the MAO gene, yes, you were more likely to have a history of antisocial violence. If and only if you were abused as a child, gene-environment interaction out the wazoo, normal childhood, your genetic variant made no difference whatsoever. You know all the implications of this, and where people have not thought about the implications of this is this damn gene variant has crept into courtrooms. Early on, it was called deplorably the warrior gene. And as soon as you gave it that name, you were all setting people up for all sorts of distortive stuff. And there are by now a number of criminal trials on the books where people got shorter sentences because it was argued they had the warrior gene version of it. Genes are inevitable, all of that. Oh my God, we know so much more subtlety about this than now. But fortunately, the warrior gene hysteria is dying down in courtrooms and such, but serotonin plays a role here. What other chemicals in the brain? As soon as we're talking about violence and antidotes to violence and all of that, what we are talking about immediately, what has to be on the list is alcohol. Everybody knows what alcohol does. Alcohol makes you aggressive. Alcohol causes people to throw people out the swinging doors in the saloon in your small western town. Alcohol disinhibits aggression. Alcohol makes people aggressive. That is what everybody knows. That is what's taught. And you know what's coming. Alcohol doesn't make you more aggressive. Alcohol makes people who are already aggressive more aggressive. Alcohol makes in people who are far from inhibit aggression in them even further. Alcohol doesn't cause anything in the brain. It exaggerates pre-existing tendencies, many of which were socially learned. Whoa, that should sound familiar from last week, where X doesn't actually cause this behavior. X lowers the threshold so that the social cues that normally elicit it do so more easily. Alcohol does not make people more violent. It makes violent people more violent. And in fact, alcohol does not do that uniformly across the board. And this comes to this whole sort of taxonomy of alcoholism. This psychiatrist, Cloninger, Wash U, did very influential work basically showing two different subtypes of alcoholism. And I'm forgetting which is Cloninger type 1 or type 2. One profile, this is somebody whose alcoholism, their drinking is in the social setting. The person is, with great predictability, is male. They are adolescent or young adult, and in the context of alcohol abuse with their peers, a lot of violence. This is the drunk, dangerous, sort of bully, threatening people in a fight or whatever sort of thing. And another characteristic of this type 1 profile is by around age 30 or so, the alcoholism has subsided. The antisocial behavior has subsided. We're going to hear this great sound bite in a while that one of the best crime fighting tools there is a 30th birthday. The type 1, this is type 1 profile, social abuse with peers early in life, and then that disappears. The other profile is equally found in men and women, and this is lifelong alcoholics, where you are doing the drinking alone. You are not dysfunctional as an alcoholic. You are high functioning. This is the person living alone, and every evening for the last 40 years in their empty apartment comes home and drinks a lot alone in the evening, day after day. This is not a profile that's associated with aggression, with antisocial behavior of any sort. This is a variant of social withdrawal. There's another bit of evidence saying that alcohol does not make people violent. Alcohol makes people who are already violent, who have already been socialized into being violent, more violent. And this comes from some really interesting cross-cultural studies. Over the middle of the 20th century, all sorts of isolated cultures on Earth suddenly got westernized big time, mostly thanks to militaries suddenly being all over the Pacific during World War II. And we've already heard some of the consequences of that obesity outbreak, which would occur as soon as people switch to westernized diets. But one of the other things that you can now study in islands scattered all throughout the Pacific is what happens when there's suddenly plentiful amounts of alcohol available. How do people learn how you're supposed to act when you're drunk? And what the studies show, Bruce Nuft at UCSD has done this, what the studies show is basically people would learn how you're supposed to behave based on what you would see other people doing, what the colonial sort of powers that have shown up there, how they go about getting drunk. And I don't know what islands that were like seized by the Brits, people learned to be drunken fighters, and islands seized by the French, everybody would jump into bed with each other when they had drunk too much. But you are learning the social cues as to what is appropriate for you, your subculture, any of that. When you have alcohol on board, alcohol does not cause violence, inevitably. Okay, so now we switch to our next bucket here. Now, in the seconds to minutes before, what environmental stimuli are triggering aggression, or triggering compassion, or altruism, or intervening, or some such thing? Some of this is thoroughly boring, like if somebody's coming at you with a knife, whoa, that's going to be an environmental stimulus. It's going to do all sorts of things to your amygdala. Obviously, where we're heading is stimuli that are subliminal, that you don't even notice, that are below the threshold, or if you notice them, you would never think that those are relevant to anything going on. Visual stimuli, all sorts of versions that are relevant. One that is, at first pass, the most damn depressing finding in the whole literature out there, but we will be dissecting it later on in this lecture. Take people, stick them in a brain scanner, I'm fairly sure I've already mentioned this, flash up faces at some speed, and flash them up, and flash up the face of a them. Them, different race, green beard markers of different religion, different ethnicity, all of that, flash up the face of the them, and in about 75% of people, the amygdala activates. Not because you sit there and say, oh my God, those people did this thing to my ancestors 300 years ago, but the amygdala activates in 60 to 70 milliseconds, 60 to 70 thousandths of a second. We know this already, and this is well replicated, and most of the literature is when you're looking at the face of someone of a different race. We already know one of the things that then happens, which is in your average subject where this happens, a few seconds later, dorsolateral PFC kicks in, silences the amygdala. Don't think that way. That's not who I am. And we already saw that people where this doesn't happen, and this just keeps on throbbing there at the face of a them, these are people who are unapologetic. These are people who are proudly white supremacists, for example. But what we will be getting to is who the 25% is that don't react this way, and what short-term manipulations you could make so that this response doesn't occur. And that's going to be really interesting because it's a lot easier than you think. The punchline to that being, the amygdala is really wired up to divide the world into us and them, but it could be incredibly easy and rapid as to change who counts as an us and who counts as a them. We'll be seeing that in a lot more detail. In terms of categories that are automatic, we'll see it's really easy to change your categorization of somebody by same race, other race, into some other characteristic really fast. That's easy. The one realm where it is virtually impossible to do is with sex. You cannot get somebody to look at people of different sexes and have something, the type of hat they're wearing, become the more important signal for the categories you make. That is a much stronger sort of implicit signal than is race. And we'll be looking at aspects of that. More things with visual cues. Take a bus stop. Take a bus stop and put up a poster there with a pair of eyes looking at you, and people litter less. Have eyes like that flash up on a computer screen, and people cheat less in an economic game. This sense of being monitored, a visual cue, of being monitored. Another version of it, criminology, was like revolutionized in the 80s by the broken window theory. The notion that if you let people get away with low-level crimes, everyone's going to habituate to, like, criminal stuff goes on, it's not a big deal, and people are going to be murderers before you know it. If you have a neighborhood in which people can break windows without major consequences, soon there will be an environment with litter, with dirt, with broken windows, with graffiti. Unconsciously is desensitizing you to law violations, to disorder, and disinhibits more antisocial behavior. This was super popular. Rudy Giuliani in the 80s, when he was the mayor of New York, rode to fame by instituting the zero tolerance thing for graffiti stuff, for litterers, all of that, out of a belief in the broken window hypothesis. So, auditory stimuli, somebody yells, "I'm going to shoot you," and whoa, that activates the amygdala. That's not surprising at all. Same punchline, subliminal cues, subliminal auditory cues. One great study that was done by this guy who is a graduate of this class from about 20 years ago, showing put somebody in a brain scanner, flashing up faces of same race, other race, all of that, and the usual, if you were a white subject, 75% of such subjects will activate the amygdala when the face of somebody who's black is flashed up. What he did in this study is he had background music playing. One of two types, either rap music, and this was when this was completely 99.9% associated with African American culture rather than like suburban white kids trying to become rappers, all of that. Rap music, when it had a very, very strong connotation with that, or good old boy Southern heavy metal music, Southern white connotations. And what he showed was, depending on what music was playing in the background, if it was rap music, the amygdaloid response to a white person to a black face was exaggerated. If it was irritating, awful, Southern heavy metal stuff, the amygdaloid response was lessened, modulated in those ways. More stuff. Olfactory cues. We already know some of this, which is the version of the gustatory insular cortex. There, if you have rotten smells around, people become more socially conservative about social issues. If you have wonderful smells of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, people become more generous in their gameplay and Prisoner's Dilemma type stuff. Whoa, subliminal olfactory cues. That has something to do with that. And I think we already heard about this one experiment showing subliminal sensitivity to olfactory information. This was the study where either people jumped out of an airplane for the first time, and as soon as they hit the ground, the grad students swarmed over them and mopped up their sweat from their armpits into little cotton balls. Or you got somebody who just had a great time on a jog or whatever, and now their armpits have been swabbed, so swabbed armpit pheromones of somebody scared out of their mind or somebody enjoying their exercise. And what was shown in that study was people found the happy sweat to be more appealing of a smell. I think probably the reality is less unappealing of a smell, but most importantly, when people smelled the scared sweat, the terrified sweat, there was activation of the amygdala subliminally. More stuff like that in our final minute. When people are hungry, they become less generous. They become less understanding of somebody else's problem. Interoceptive stuff. Verbal things. You get completely different gameplay in sort of economic games, if you call it the Wall Street game versus the cooperation game. You get completely different judgments from mock juries if you use words like wrong or emotionally laden terms like blameworthy. Or, as a really cool study, in this study, people had to sit and unscramble mixed up words or identified words, fix the misspellings in them or some such thing. And in one case, it was just a whole bunch of totally innocuous words. And in the other group, it was words scattered with religious primes. Hell misspelled. Heaven scrambled as letters, God, some such thing. And what you saw was when people were unconsciously trying to unscramble or correct the spelling of words with religious cues, they became more pro-social in the aftermath and had no clue whatsoever as to where that was coming from. More things. One of the most reliable environmental sensory stimuli for aggression is pain. Pain, and you better bet all those pain pathways go screamingly into the amygdala in no time whatsoever, and we see frustration, stress, all of those fitting into that, and we saw the example of what I think was not anthropomorphizing, those two instances of baboon rape, alpha male the day he was toppled, that as evidence. And what you see is other patterns. When the economy gets bad, rates of spousal abuse and child abuse increase. When unemployment increases, rates of all of that happen in one really, really shocking study. You look at people who are fanatic fans of some football team, and I can't remember if this was British football or American, but when your team lost unexpectedly when they were favored, spousal abuse goes up that evening. Spousal abuse in the aftermath, frustration, pain, stress, all of those make for a hyperreactive amygdala and make for a frontal cortex that is less able to constrain stuff because it is busy swarming in those stress hormones. Final point in this domain, everybody knows that poverty increases crime. Poverty does not. What a very large literature shows is, independent of the degree of poverty, it's the amount of wealth that you are surrounded with. It is poverty amid plenty, which is the predictor. It is income inequality. And this has been shown on the level of countries, in the U.S. on the level of states, cities. There is one study showing it block by block in Chicago. Poverty does not cause violence. Poverty, when your nose is being rubbed in it all the time by the haves, reminding you that you are a have-not, that's what drives it. Okay, so we will pick up on Friday, continuing with this, and then hurtling through the rest of the list there.